Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma. We are continuing our study of the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25, demonstrating that it is a singular unit. It cannot be, is not divided into a discussion of the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70 versus a yet future literal physical coming of Christ at the end of time. That is simply an untenable position, although that's the way I was raised. I was raised believing that Matthew 24, 4 to 35 talked about, AD 70, the events leading up to and consummating in Jesus' spiritual coming in judgment of Old Covenant Israel in AD 70. But verse 36 now, when it says, "But of that day and hour knows no man," I was convinced. I taught. I debated. That verse 36 divided the chapter. But I argued that from a position of not having actually studied the text for myself. When I was asked by a ladies' Bible study group to teach the Olivet Discourse, I realized I had never actually systematically, thoroughly, independently studied the Olivet Discourse for myself. I had repeated the commentaries. I had repeated what the, quote, famous preachers, unquote, of my fellowship taught, but I hadn't studied it for myself. And so, when the ladies asked me to teach a Bible class, I was new at the congregation, I just told them, I said, "Look, ladies, I've got to tell you, I don't really know. I think I do, but I don't really know for sure if what I believe about this is what it says. So you got to give me 1 year to prepare." That's what I told them. And they were like, "Wait a minute, you just graduated from preacher school." And I told them, I said, "Well, yes, I did, but I don't know if what I was taught is what it actually says. I know what the commentaries say. I've been repeating that most of my life, but I don't know if that's the truth." So I set out to study the Olivet Discourse on my own, independently. That doesn't mean I didn't continue to read the commentaries. Doesn't mean I did not continue to consult the scholars. But I took what they said and compared it with the text, and I soon realized that the traditional view just absolutely has virtually no merit whatsoever. All of that said, I shared with you yesterday Jesus' prediction, repeated 2 or 3 times in Matthew chapter 24, that before his coming, before his parousia, false Christ, false prophets would arise. Now, as a real quick digression, Sam Frost wants you to believe that the coming of the Son of Man on the clouds of heaven was Jesus' ascension. Then that means that before Jesus' ascension, the false teachers, the false prophets, the false messiahs had to have arisen and caused the great apostasy. Because you see, Matthew chapter 24, verses 9 and following, 10 and following specifically, predicted the arrival of the false teachers, the false prophets, who would cause the great apostasy. And he taught the arrival of those false prophets all before his parousia. So if his parousia is his ascension to the right hand of the Father of Acts chapter 1, then guess what? The arrival of the false prophets, the false apostles, the false messiahs had to have happened before his ascension and to have caused the apostasy of his believers before his ascension. You see, this is just illustrative of how Mr. Frost has just completely abandoned all logic and reason and proper exegesis. But I digress. I told you yesterday that we needed to examine whether or not the false prophets, the false teachers, the false prophets arose in the first century prior to the time of the fall of Jerusalem and the end of the Old Covenant age. And the answer to that question is an unequivocal, yes, they did. A corollary question is, was there an apostasy of widespread scope in the first century? I'll never forget, after a formal public debate that I had in approximately 1991, during a break in the debate, I had to run get a drink of water, and a fellow walks up to me and he said, look, I just don't see where you're coming from. You claimed that the great apostasy took place in the first century. He said, that's just not true. Paul was predicting that in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, and my response to him was, well, are you not aware? And first of all, let me ask you a question. Do you believe that Matthew 24, 4 to 35 or 34 was predictive of the time before the fall of Jerusalem? And he kind of stood there and he thought for a minute. He said, well, yeah. He said, that's my position. I said, okay. Are you aware of the fact that in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 12, it says, because lawlessness will abound, the love of many, and the New American Standard says, the love of the majority will grow cold. I had my New American Standard Bible with me. I handed it to him. He read it. And he goes, I didn't know that. I said, well, here's Jesus then predicting the apostasy of the majority of people before, as you're agreeing, before the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70. How then can you deny that the great apostasy, I said, how much greater of an apostasy could it be than the majority of those who fell, or of those that did fall away? And he said, I don't have an answer for that. I said, well, I appreciate your candor, so the conversation ended. Now, number one, were there false teachers, false prophets, false apostles, and messiahs in the first century? Once again, the answer to that is an unequivocal, yes, there were. Number two, was there a widespread apostasy as a direct result of those false prophets and those false apostles? Once again, the unequivocal, biblical, and historical answer to that is, yes, there was. All we have to do is, let's see, go to Acts chapter 8. In Acts chapter 8, Philip goes down to Samaria. There he preaches the kingdom of God. And he performs many miracles, and he baptizes tons of people. And there was a man by the name of Simon the Sorcerer, who claimed to be, now watch this, the great power of God. Now mind you, he's not a Christian yet, but he's a sorcerer. He's a magician. He's a wonder worker. What did Jesus say about false prophets arise and show great signs and wonders? Here's Simon, false prophet, deceiving many. He asked Philip, give me this power, or Peter, excuse me, that upon whoever I lay my hands, they may receive this power. What was Peter's response to him? You have neither part nor lot in this matter. And he condemned him. Do you suppose that Simon the sorcerer, and by the way, the historical accounts, some of them are quite phantasmagoric, but nonetheless, the historical accounts of Simon the sorcerer are absolutely incredible. The point being, Jesus predicted the arrival and the presence of false prophets who would work false miracles to deceive many. And here is Simon the sorcerer, who made himself out to be the great power of God. And he had the people convinced of that. So the question, therefore, is, why doesn't Simon qualify as one of those that Jesus warned his apostles about? Now, by the way, Jesus never said at any point, as far as I can determine from the text, that the false prophets had to be from within the Christian camp. Were they in many instances? Well, yes. Were they not in many instances? Yes. Simon the Sorcerer was not a Christian at the time of Acts chapter 8. But he was most assuredly a false prophet, a false magician working false wonders. Had he convinced people? He most assuredly had, because the people perceived him to be the great power of God. Then in Acts chapter 13, Paul, as he sails over to Cyprus, has great success in proclaiming the gospel of Christ and performing miracles. Who do we encounter there in Acts chapter 13? Well, we encounter a sorcerer by the name of Elymas. This man, just like Simon the sorcerer, made himself out to be the great power of God. He withstood Paul to the face. Oh boy, that's a major mistake. And Paul turned on him and said, "You will be blind and without sight for a season." And Elymas went blind. You know, I have challenged those who have opposed what I teach and said in regard to the end of the charismata. And I've done this in all sincerity. I've said this as humbly and as kindly with as much respect as I possibly can. If what I am teaching is so horrendous, if I am in fact opposing God and the power of God, then like Paul did to Elymas, then strike me blind. The only response that I have gotten is, "Oh, you're tempting the power of God." Wasn't Elymas tempting the power of God? Was he not challenging Paul to his face? Of course he was. When Elymas challenged Paul to his face, withstood him, did Paul say, dude, look, I can't do anything about you and your challenge because, after all, you're questioning God's power here, and you're withstanding the power of God, so I can't do anything. No. He struck him blind on the spot. That's a bit of a digression, but the point being, what do we have? We have Simon the sorcerer, and we have Elymas, two false prophets, both of whom performed false miracles. That is in direct fulfillment of Jesus' prediction of Matthew chapter 24. Upon what basis, what is the exegetical demonstration, proof, and demand that we divorce the story of Simon and the story of Elymas from Jesus' prediction in Matthew chapter 24? What's the basis for that rejection? I don't find such evidence. I do find presuppositional arguments that simply say, "Oh, no, that can't be true. Jesus was talking about the end of the Christian age." No, he wasn't. The Christian age has no end. And it's not the Christian enterprise, it's the Christian age. Now, tomorrow, we will continue as I share with you the epistolary evidence, number one, of the arrival of false prophets, both from within and without. We'll look at Acts again a little bit further, but we'll continue to look at the world in which Paul was operating and the false prophets, the false miracle workers that were there. Then again, we'll go to the epistolary evidence to see, number one, not only were the prophets there, but number two, the apostasy was fully underway at an amazingly early time. You don't want to miss it, so I'll see you on the flip side.